belong to the women. They got me when I was in England, paid the money for me, and enabled me to return to the United States in safety. Then I belong to the women of the old Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. When I went about this country, feeling that there was no place of safety for me, no valley so deep, as I used to say, no mountain so high, I was surrounded and protected by the women of old Massachusetts. And when they undertake to enlarge the boundaries of their liberty to the extent of grasping the ballot, I feel that it is as little as I can do to show myself and say amen to the movement. So these are the words of Frederick Douglass himself in the speech he gave in November 1868 in Boston, showing the centrality of women and women's rights in his life, although he had, and maybe because he had, complex relations to both. The speech is also the beginning of Professor Ford's book, Women in the World of Frederick Douglass, published last year, in which she explores what she calls the feminine space in Douglass's life, what she also calls the negative space. So this book illuminates relationships that I think are vital to understand Douglass's life, thought, and worldview, in a very nuanced, empathetic, and ethical way. So Professor Ford teaches history at Lemoyne College. In 2003, she published Southern Womanhood and Slavery, a biography of Louisa S. McCord, the biography of a planter / pro-slavery / anti-feminist writer. Leigh Ford is also the associate editor of the first volume of Frederick Douglass's correspondence, published by Yale University Press in 2009. So her book, Women in the World of Frederick Douglass, won the 2018 Herbert Lehman Prize for Scholarship in New York History and the Society of Historians of the Early Republic's 2018 Mary Kelly Prize. Her new project is based on the Little House on the Prairie. So it is our pleasure to welcome Professor Leigh Ford, and the title of her talk is The Book I Did Not Write, Other Approaches to Women in the World of Frederick Douglass. Professor Ford.
On her birthday in 1890, Rosetta Douglass Sprague's father wrote to her that, after telling her, you have now reached the age which no one can consider you as young, 51 years ago, I had no idea that I should live to see you at your present age. Now, he was 72 at the time and lived another 5 years. Over this summer, I turned 51 in July, myself. And yes, I own my age. And I shared this letter with my father. And he too felt its sense of amazement and also mortality that 51 years earlier, he himself would ever reach 51 years of age himself, much less his own 75 years. And that the little pink baby he held would ever be 51 herself. He lived another 6 weeks. I wrote this paper tonight in the aftermath of his death, which occurred 1 month ago this past Tuesday. Revisiting what I consider my intellectual failings in this time was not fun, and it was a bit of a struggle just to focus my brain in the aftermath of this. And then doing that, of course, fed into, my paper sucks, and I'm an intellectual fraud, and they're all gonna figure it out. And, I'm not alone in feeling this, okay. And actually, at one point, I'm sitting there just almost weeping because of everything, and I actually considered dropping out of this conference. And Helen's, but I didn't. I kept going, and one thing my father was always afraid of was, you do not quit anything! I failed him in that a few times. But yesterday, this sense of grief and fraudulence kind of overcame me. And I do apologize for the papers. I did not attend the plenary, I did not attend the reception, I did not attend because it was just all of this kind of was overcoming me. And so I went to the Musée d'Orsay. Well, you know, there's something about art and beauty and not being an expert in something and just enjoying it that I don't know is helpful. And on our way there, we passed Shakespeare and Company, and I had to go. And going into this bookstore, an actual bookstore with actual books, and not a Barnes and Noble, and going into, and especially a bookstore that represents, you know, maybe not in that site, but in this city, English letters in this city. And then to be in there and to think, you know, here I am, the author of an actual book, in this store that meant so much to English letters, to authors that inspired me. And I'm in this city and I've been invited to talk about a book I wrote, an actual book I wrote that won prizes. And, you know, and about an author who, because of his love of reading, had reached out to me across the centuries, like a soul was talking to a soul, a reader talking to a reader, that, you know, my mood kind of, I mean, it was a very complicated mood. I'm finding there's emotions that don't have words for it. But I thought, you know, I miss my dad. But I've been gifted. I've had such a great gift. And this is part of it. And so I am really grateful to be here. And I'm grateful to the organizers for inviting me. I'm grateful for the funders for giving money. And I'm grateful for all of you for coming here. And I don't blame you for not sitting in the front row. I do sweat and sometimes I have hot flashes if you want. But I am honestly grateful for this. So thank you. So that's my long introduction that I just wrote today because it came to me. So on to the actual paper, the book I didn't write. Most people actually present papers about the work they actually have completed or the works that are in progress, and certainly I could stand up here and present my standard book talk that I have given several times about women in the world of Frederick Douglass. And that was likely what the organizers had in mind when they invited me, and they probably want me to use bigger words than I normally use, because audiences do actually expect bands to play their greatest hits. When you invite the Rolling Stones, not that I'm the Rolling Stones, you do expect them to play Satisfaction. You want Satisfaction. But, you know, we should all have these problems. But I don't want to bore myself, because that will bore you. And I know this from classes. And then my gremlins gave me an idea. Do you know what gremlins are? You're like, oh, the movie, right? Okay, gremlins are what I call, you know those voices in your head? The ones, some of you do because you laughed earlier, but they're the ones that they paralyze me. They're the ones that keep me from starting to write or from finishing a project. They're the ones that tell you, you suck. How dare you? They're the ones that they tell you, you forgot that? You didn't consider this? They're the ones that say, you know, those scholars over there, they're going to say you left out. Oh, the feminists are going to say, oh, the African American Studies scholars are going to come down on you for this. And they're reader number 3. They're your bad karma coming to bite you in the butt. They're your inner critic. They're the woman in the 3rd row giving you the stink eye. They're the internet trolls. We all know what I'm talking about. All come to life to rip your work to shreds, all before it even gets on the screen, and it's all in. Okay. So, all these gremlins, they inspired this paper today. They wanted to know why I did not write this whole library of other books that they expected to read. And this is why. So, first, because, you know, I don't have Douglas's ego, so I can't presume you all are here and have read my book. So to give you, that was the laugh line. Ha ha ha! Okay, To summarize the book, Women in the World of Frederick Douglass. This is what it looks like. I think it's reasonably priced. It tells the story the way that key women created Frederick Douglass, both the man and the phenomena, Frederick Douglass. You know, how they taught him to survive slavery, how they spurred his intellectual development, how they ensured his economic well-being, and how they preserved his legacy after he was dead. And from this story emerges an outline of Frederick Douglass via what I call the negative feminine space around him. That's an artistic term, where you create the space around an object so you get an idea of what the object looks like. And when I started writing this book, that seemed like a simple task. Recreating this space, however, required really rethinking the roles of women in the lives of great men. It wasn't like they were just there. The cliche behind every great man is an even greater woman, or as a joke goes, she's usually quite surprised, is both true and tells you absolutely nothing about him, about her, or about the alchemy that produces by the relationship. Thus, in rewriting Douglass's life among women, and to take those women's lives seriously, I had to reconsider the configuration of a black man and a white woman together in public, in the civic sphere, as equals, and rescue that from prurience. I had to grant it political significance. And I had to take seriously the importance of domesticity, domestic labor, and privacy. They also had to have some kind of political significance, some significance beyond just the household. And even the doctrine of separate spheres had to be resurrected as a tool with significant cultural value to an African-American couple fleeing slavery. Furthermore, the motives of women as actors with agenda, background, context of their own had to be uncovered and recreated themselves. If their relationships with Douglass, his life, and his work were going to make any sense at all. So to do this, I found that I had to actually re-research Douglass's life from the ground up. And here my methods ultimately had to become more and more conservative. And that's my methods as opposed to my politics, because white girls from the South do not normally write about black men. At least not the way I do. So I had to be careful and even very old-fashioned in my methods as I documented humor and interactions more often than I constructed an argument informed by theory. And this shaped the book that I did write, which emphasizes women who worked and lived closely with Douglass and who could be traced somehow or other through the archives, that is, on paper or in paper. And I thought this approach was absolutely necessary because so much had been written about women, particularly in the abolitionists and in the women's rights movement, and sometimes so much had been written about women around Douglass, and most of it was like not really grounded in anything, and then so much had been written about Douglass. But these two things never quite intersected in any satisfying way. And in some ways, especially when you're talking about the women's movement, the abolitionist movement, they created this syllogism that never quite explained or proved itself. One would say, well, Douglass said this according to the secondary sources. They would say, well, Douglass was doing this according to these secondary sources. But trying to find really what was going on in that within the documents became a new, tricky problem. Therefore, I had to rebuild Douglass's biography from documents with a fresh eye. And that fresh eye often meant simply a woman's eye, or an eye for women. This also meant compiling as much evidence as I possibly could. And I took some, like I remember watching All the President's Men and Ben Bradley saying, you need 2 sources. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to use that as my mantra. Also, follow the money. You laugh. That's how I found the importance of Julia Griffiths. Follow the money. Okay. So this meant compiling as much evidence I possibly could, especially when going against information considered consensus, just that's conventional wisdom, or in making informed judgments, because sometimes you have to make these leaps. So you want to have as much information as you can to make these leaps, especially when you don't have information about certain women. You want to get as much information around that woman as possible to get kind of, there's a hole where she should be. So you want to kind of get a better idea of the shape of that hole where she should be. There's a hole where that decision was made. You're never going to get at that decision, but you want to get an idea of what is around that decision. What are the contingencies? What are the possibilities? So getting as much information as I could. And I wanted this book to honor the range of choices faced by the women in Douglas's life, and the decisions made by those women and by Douglas. And I wanted this book to stand as a work of honest, solid scholarship that could serve as a useful foundation for others. But in making the choice to tell the story this way, other choices fell by the wayside. And some of those choices are the ones that I want to discuss today, because those are the books that I didn't write. Those are the ones that the gremlins are going, but the critics are going to say. And the biggest one was this. The book that I did write, I consider a work of women's history. The book that I did not write was a gender history. Okay. That is, I wrote a book about women and the things that they did in the life of Frederick Douglass. I did not write about, as philosophers would say, I'm team teaching with a philosopher, so I'm learning all these new things, those women's performances of their gender, or the way that they did their gender, in tandem with the way Douglas performed or did his. And as we see from many papers here this week, and as you know, it just kind of is there, Douglas on manhood writes itself. He was literally the man. He had very clear ideas about masculinity. He and his black male cohorts staked their demand for citizenship not only on their own performance of manhood, but on their depictions of themselves as men superior to those men who claimed to own, literally own them. True men proved themselves through physicality, which included self and community defense, self-control, which included sexual restraint, and civic morality, which included self-reliance, intellectual development, and community leadership. And you see all of these hallmarks throughout Douglas's autobiographies and biographies. Early in his life, he seized his manhood from the dehumanization of slavery, transforming himself, in his own words, from a brute to a man. Through resistance, literacy, liberation, marriage, and fatherhood. He rose above what he himself characterized as the infantilization of his early anti-slavery activism among the Garrisonians by establishing his economic, political, and intellectual independence with his newspaper. During the Civil War and Reconstruction years, his rhetoric became explicitly masculine, or what I like to call butch, with men of color to arms forming the basis of citizenship that required the right to vote. He and other black men emerged from black communities in order to lead them, portraying themselves as representative of all African Americans, a point that, of course, chafed the women, especially such later 19th century women leaders as Anna Julia Cooper and Mary Church Terrell, but even women of his own time. Douglas's ideas about womanhood have yet to be fully explored. The dominant ideology of his time, true womanhood, consisted of that loose mix of attributes, as we've all read the article probably, classified under the heading of purity, piety, domesticity, and submission. Now, the enslaved women among whom Douglas grew up had been barred from all but the submissive element of this construction, and quite often this extended to free black women like his wife Anna. And the darker or poorer you were, the further you were pushed out of even the chance to be considered a true woman. The activist women among whom he worked, especially the white ones, armored themselves with that piety and purity, submitting themselves only to God in their anti-slavery work. And for most women, domesticity seemed an inescapable fact of life upon marriage, especially once they had children. But domesticity held different meaning for someone like Anna Douglas than it did for someone like Susan B. Anthony, or Angelina Grimke Weld, or even Abby Kelly Foster. Try as they might. Douglas incorporated, now did Douglas incorporate, sorry, how did Douglas incorporate these ideals into his own navigation of gender? Okay. And how did it play into the difficulties and choices made, for instance, by his daughter Rosetta, who faced a very rough road? How about his granddaughters, who were more of that Anna Julia Cooper generation? Or in his son's choice of wives? How did this affect his politics and his activism, especially in regard to women, either in the Black Civil Rights Movement or, as I know you're thinking, the women's rights movement? And certainly most people, scholars or otherwise, know him as that self-proclaimed women's rights man. In fact, generally first people will tell me, oh, you wrote a book on Frederick Douglass and women. You know, he was a women's rights man. You know, he was for women's suffrage. I'm like, oh, really? I'm sorry, I'm being sarcastic. I haven't even had a drink yet. Now, in general, he did believe in the equality of men and women, grounded in natural rights arguments in opposition to contemporary ideas that insisted upon women's intellectual inferiority. You know, we have brains not big enough for thoughts, just big enough for love. That is an actual quote. Well, okay, it's not a quote, it's a paraphrase. He declared, "We hold woman to be justly entitled to all we claim for man," when he reported on the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. At the Worcester Convention in 1851, generally contemporarily considered the first women's rights, national women's rights convention, he insisted that we advocate women's rights not because she is an angel, but because she is woman, having the same wants and being exposed to the same evils as man. In 1870, he threw himself in with the nascent women's suffrage movement, writing that, "So far as respects its relation to woman, our government is, in its essence, a simple usurpation, a government of force and not of reason." Plus ça change. Like African Americans, women should be granted equal rights as American citizens. And a solution for women's inequality seemed to be the same: integration. In a seemingly impromptu speech he made at the 1858 National Women's Rights Convention in New York City, one of the few that he actually attended in the 1850s, he said that a woman could do anything a man could do, sounding a bit like my, younger self. Anything more? Okay, sorry. And by so doing could assimilate herself to man. In other words, if women just stepped up and did what men did, they would become equal. Now, Douglas's deeds to help women to do so did follow suit. He was a man, to a certain extent, of his word. He and a small but important cadre of black men insisted upon women's vocal inclusion as speakers and representatives at black men's convention. And he not only supported women's equal education and employment, but participated in such efforts, educated his own daughter further than his sons, and employed women in his own offices whenever he could. After all, Julia Griffith was his business manager. His daughter and his whole Recorder of Deeds offices was filled with women. Not that that was uncommon, but he's hiring women. Educating his daughter further than his sons, that was necessary because if you're going to have a respectable job for a black young woman, she's going to have to be educated further than a boy. But when you see all of these efforts on behalf of women, you're not seeing them so much in the women's rights movement as he's bringing women's rights into the black civil rights movement. Okay? And whereas the black civil rights movement is kind of elevating the community, that's where he can kind of push this agenda a little further. And all of this is great, this is fine, except white supremacy is not the same as patriarchy. And whereas Douglass might fare well as an ally for women's equality in women's history, in gender history, he still made patriarchal bargains that hesitated to challenge male superiority, especially that of African American men. Take, for instance, that moment in 1869 over the ratification of the 15th Amendment, when it began tearing apart the coalition of the American Equal Rights Association. Okay. There's this big confrontation. And he and Susan B. Anthony, they're just like throwing down. I picture them with gloves going, okay, the gloves are off. Okay. That should have been in the play about them. Encountering Susan B. Anthony's opposition to the amendment, he catalogs a list of horrible atrocities committed upon African Americans by unreconstructed white Southerners, saying that when women face the same, and he by implication meant white women, face the same, then they will have an urgency to obtain the ballot equal to our own. A voice shot back, is that not true about black women? To which he replied, not because she's woman, but because she's black. Okay. And I always thought the black women in the audience are like, how do I separate those two? It's kind of both. So, in making this reply, he avoided gender-specific outrages, such, and the word was outrages, rape, and entirely missed the impossibility of black women separating their gender from their race. Now, he's well aware of these abuses that they're going on. I mean, just read his autobiography, and the Aunt Hester episode is clear. He uses terms outrage. But he constructs an argument here that relies upon a gender norm in which ultimately black manhood is going to defend black womanhood, protecting black women's sexual virtue that was presumably lost as a victim of sexual exploitation. He ignored, too, a point that Sojourner Truth had been making for quite some time, that black womanhood sometimes needs protection from black manhood. And also another point that Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, herself now a widow with children, black womanhood needs to have that kind of self-reliance that he himself had been pursuing to take care of her own. Now, Douglass's tactic was pragmatic for the political moment of passing the 15th Amendment. From the standpoint of women's history, too, black women claimed black men's electoral power as community property and therefore gained the same political influence wielded by white women. Okay? That was their patriarchal bargain. Through the lens of gender, however, black women remained subordinate to black men. And indeed, this takes me to the next book that I did not write. And this was actually a question that plagued me from the very beginning. And one that I think also plagues people who kind of, they won't come out and say it, they have a problem with me being a white woman writing about this subject. Yes, I am white. I know, it's a shock. Okay. The book that I did write was an integrated history of women. The book I did not write was one solely about black women. Black women, of course, occupy a large portion of the pages. Douglass's mother, grandmother, sisters, Aunt Katie, Anna Douglass, his daughter Rosetta Douglass Sprague, her daughters, Ida B. Wells. They all have portions or whole chapters devoted to their experience. Still, I expected there to be far more black women, especially in the reformist circles. You know, we're in a book about a black man working for black civil rights. And certainly the questions about Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Jacobs, always crop up in question and answer sessions. Okay. So the big question is why? Douglass debated Sojourner Truth. It's right there in the paper. He worked with Harriet Tubman, moving people to Canada. It's in the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society documents. He and Harriet Jacobs had a mutual friend in Amy Post who got Harriet Jacobs' narrative novel published. And Harriet Jacobs' brother had an office in the same building as Douglas's newspaper's office. And in fact, I like to imagine Jacobs and Douglas having, Harriet Jacobs and Douglas having a conversation about what Douglas's mother's experience would have been when you take into consideration what her experience was trying to stay with her children. You think about that. He brought Louisa Dorsey, one of the leading African-American women of Philadelphia, with whom Rosetta had stayed with very happily when she was looking for a teaching job in Philadelphia. He brought Louisa Dorsey with him to crash Abraham Lincoln's inaugural ball. He ensured that Mary Ann Shadd, Edmonia Highgate, and other women got hearings at black men's conventions. He debated Sarah Parker Remond. Fanny and Ella Barrier stayed at his home in Washington, D.C. He published black women writers in all of his newspapers. The list goes on. I mean, they're there. So why were none of these women among those who formed him in the same way that, for instance, Julia Griffiths did? The answer may lie, again, in the way you construct the narrative. Okay? In the kaleidoscopic motion of different gendered versions of activism, they don't necessarily make Douglas the center or the great man. Okay? Douglas established himself as, and fashioned himself as, the self-made man, proprietor of his own business, head of his household, lecturer, writer, leader of African Americans, all firmly within the idea of masculinity. Now, he didn't expect women to be subordinate to him. He was certainly not going, little lady, go in the kitchen. I know you're going, Anna, Anna. He wasn't forcing her there. In fact, he praised and aided women, both black and white, who did the exact same things that he did. He admired them for that. But all of that self-reliance, well, we all know there's a whole team of people making that self-reliance happen. And two, really, he usually, they used to call it in the 60s, you need a wife at home and a wife at the office. You know, so he needed a helpmeet. What? He needed a helpmeet, and he had one at home, and he had one at the office. And while other abolitionists criticized the one at the office, Julia Griffiths, for identifying, and they said this, the whole of the anti-slavery movement as being Douglas. Douglas actually required someone who could devote their energies to him if this business were to survive. Furthermore, she was able to mobilize a group of anti-slavery women in Rochester willing to devote a portion of their fundraising activities to support his paper, much the way the American Anti-Slavery Society had devoted their attentions to the National Anti-Slavery Standard, but also Garrison's Liberator. Okay. So leaving aside the peculiarities that made Griffiths herself individually successful, her sharp focus on Douglas as the fulcrum of her anti-slavery activism differed significantly from African-American women's activism. Griffiths operated from a sense of benevolence rather than collective self-preservation. While African-American women's organizations were among the first to lend support to Frederick Douglass, a group in Philadelphia raised money and sent him, much needed dollars in the early days before Julia Griffiths showed up, they couldn't take him on as a singular cause the way Julia Griffiths was, and the way Julia Griffiths was mobilizing these Rochester ladies to. They took care of their own communities, which allowed them to navigate very dangerous racialized implications of true womanhood, while constructing their own version of an active black womanhood. And then at home, Douglas's self-reliance relied upon that domestic labor of Anna, and as well as other black women in the family, his daughter, his sister-in-law, his Rosetta's sister-in-law who moved in with them, whole host of other people who come in, women in the family. And while later generations, including their daughter Rosanna, attempted to kind of create Anna in a recognizable mode of activism, the evidence and her own actions suggest that Anna instead embraced this domesticity of true womanhood. And in doing so, Anna avoided the civic sphere of anti-slavery organization inhabited by Julia Griffiths or other African-American women activists. And this differentiated her from Louisa Dorsey, who helped Douglass crash Abraham Lincoln's ball, or Carolyn Loveland and Syracuse, the wives of her husband's contemporaries Thomas Dorsey and Germaine Logan. And yet she also hailed from a very different background than those two women. Those two women grew up in northern free communities from families of some socioeconomic standing. In fact, Carolyn Logan's family had money that allowed her to support Germaine so that he could kind of be a full-time abolitionist. And so they kind of made in a nice house. She was pregnant while he was off. Well, it's another story. Anyway, so Anna faced and indeed lived the life of a working class black woman well into her 30s. To her, this kind of domesticity, having her own home and her own family and a husband who could take care of this was more aspirational for her. Plus, there's a whole other host of other things that kind of play into it, like people being disdainful of her. So she's not quite the person like Carolyn Loveland who can move between the two worlds. So as Douglass moves out of this gender-integrated world of abolitionism and into the gender-specific masculine world of military recruitment and partisan politics, women become less essential to his professional survival, and thus his relationships to them shifted. His interest in education, employment, and universal suffrage continued, but in these arenas, he was not the same type of leader that he had been in anti-slavery. And the gender dynamics shifted with the rise of a younger generation of activists, especially women activists. And these activists included women like Ida B. Wells, who pressed Douglass to speak out against lynching with her own campaign. But understand, Ida B. Wells was even kind of a bit of an outlier because she didn't play well with others. My students read a biography, and they're like, they thought she was awesome, but they were like, she didn't really play well with others. But anyway, she was awesome. But, you know, she presses Douglass to speak out against lynching with her own campaign. And that leads to the third book I didn't write. The book I did write was a history of deeds, of people interacting with one another and doing things. The book that I did not write was a history of ideas. That is, what people thought and how one person's ideas influenced another's. Douglass's intellectual development and curiosity runs throughout his biography, and women, of course, play key roles in this intellectual development. Sophia Auld teaches him to read, lights that spark. Julia Griffiths, in all likelihood, supplied the first books that began his library, and she's the literary editor of his newspaper. She continued to contribute to his collection when she lived in Rochester. Her own background in publishing and her literary views brought great literature, one of his great loves, into his life. Adelia Asing added another layer with translated German language literature and philosophy. And while many broad statements had been made about the subject, how they're influenced, I have yet to see any sort of meticulous textual study, or maybe it's out there and I'm just embarrassing myself here with not reading, but that looks at, for instance, the examination of libraries and the emergence of ideas and phrases in Douglass's work that can be traced with his association with either one of them and the reading material with which they supplied him. And in the case of Wells, her research pressed him to speak out on an issue which he had heretofore hesitated to waste moral capital on. And you can see, and this was, I thought, was just so kind of really awesome. You can see this conversation between the two of them. She puts out her Southern horrors, and she goes to him, and then he puts out a statement on anti-lynching. And then she's writing, and they're in conversation with each other. And it made me wonder, were there earlier instances, as yet unexplored conversations with women, well, a lot of other people, that this kind of close textual analysis might reveal? Especially since Douglas published so many writers, amongst which were women, including Black women, and he read and knew so many others. So can their ideas be traced into his own? Did he incorporate them? Did he reject them? And if they can't be, what does that say as well? So what I offer here, and again, this is just the tip of the iceberg of what the book isn't. What I offer here are really just suggestions and hypotheses, beginnings of books that I didn't write, rather than ends. Certainly there's more to do on family, more to do on community, more to do on everything. That's all the gremlins saying, you forgot, you forgot, you forgot. You could have done, you could have done, you could have done. And my editor would have said, how many volumes do you want? I'd say, I'm not that smart. Okay, so, you know, in researching a book, you see, and this is, it's like sit there and I'd be writing and I'd look out my window because my desk is under a window. And you see this person and all the other people you're writing about as well. You see their lives in these like 3 and 4, and God, is there a 5th dimension? I mean, not Aquarius, but you see this person's life in all of these dimensions. But you have to take all of your data and you have to marshal it into this single dimension of a line, the line on the page. And doing that, so much information you have to shed and shed and shed, and so many characters don't enter the story, so many perspectives don't enter the story, so many stories don't enter the story. And the slight alteration, the slight choice in the direction of that single narrative line that could include other data, other characters, ask other questions, could yield an entirely different dimension to this story you're trying to tell, and tell a whole other story. So you shift the focus from women to gender. And the women who didn't manifest in this story, like the women who I'm like, the Black women who I'm like, where are they? Shifted to gender, and maybe there they are. Okay? They might appear. And along with that, the reason. So change your methods from individuals to networks or communities, and conversations are going to emerge that would demonstrate influences that have been overlooked. And then you go, why? Why didn't anyone see that? And so the book that I didn't write, as I said, I wanted to, this ultimately, like, okay, I can't say everything, but this is going to be the foundation. I hope I gathered enough evidence and told enough of a base story, because the book that I didn't write, all the books I didn't write, shut up, gremlins, all the books that I didn't write, they become other books that other scholars will write somewhere in the future. So thank you. Hopefully you